Dominic Pimenta, and a few people on Twitter have sent me this video. It's called Viral Issue Crucial Update. It's by a guy called Ivor Cummins, who tweets on Twitter, on this website called Fat Emperor, and he makes these videos, and they're very, very popular, and I've been sent a few of them. And normally I wouldn't watch things on YouTube because it's not a scientific medium. There's scientific papers for that, so if there's something new or interesting or theoretical, then people tend to write it up, and the reason they do that is so other scientists will then look over their work, but you escape all that on YouTube. So I thought I'd do a quick sort of peer review, because I've seen this in a few doctors groups. So why don't we start from the beginning and give it a watch.
I've been asked by many people
It's got a
for
nice voice.
an update to the last summary I did of the data and science and facts around our viral issue. It's been a few weeks, so here's the...
Slightly take issue with the use of science, because we'll keep coming back to this, but I watched this video a couple of times already, and he uses a lot of data which either is unverified or wrongly attributed, or just from people from Twitter who don't have any background or qualifications or anything to scrutinize. So it's not quite the scientific process as we would know it. So it's not science, really.
Crucial update. I'm going to start with the curves for deaths per million for many European countries: Italy, UK, Ireland, Sweden, and as you can see, they're all very similar in shape, and the epidemic largely ended around May.
Yeah, so he picks 5 countries that all had mandatory lockdowns: Italy, UK, Ireland, and then Sweden had a voluntary lockdown with sort of 50% of people working from home, secondary schools closed, mass gatherings banned, and many people shielded in the over 70s.
May, early June, and now we're down to very low levels, and this is entirely in line with influenza epidemics.
So it's not, because it starts in March, which is well outside the normal influenza season, and continues on to April and June, which would be very unusual
in the past. So I'm going to show that Europe, the average here is similar shape, of course, and there were some countries with lesser impacts, and we're going to show you why shortly. So there's Europe. The important thing to note is that, as per Professor Michael Levitt, in the northern
So I'm not sure why he's quoting Michael Levitt there, who I believe is a Nobel Prize winning chemist. But Gompertz curves, I had to look this up actually, are sigmoid functions, so an S-shaped function that we see in biology. This isn't that shape typical of a graph, but I can kind of see what he's saying, where you have a slow rise and an exponential phase, another slow rise again, and that'd be typical of something like tumor growth. I don't think it really applies to these particular types of graphs, but it's certainly not the Gompertz curve as you'd normally describe
like Europe or North America, Northeast, you get a Gompertz curve. And the reason is because the virus, when it comes in new, it rapidly hits around 20% of the population. So around 80%, it's becoming clear, are already de facto immune through cross-immunity, T-cell, mucosal immunity.
Okay, so there's so much there to unpack. It's really, really difficult. So I think the first thing he says is 20% of the people, 20% of the population are infected, which is way above many estimates for how many actual infection cases we had in all of the countries on this graph from serology data. The second thing he says then is, and I think this is right, he then says if 20% get it, that's 14 million people in the UK, and we'll come back to that, then 80% are de facto immune. So the first thing to say about that sentence is it's wrong, because if you have a disease coming into a country where 80% of the population are already immune, you already have herd immunity, which seems to be what we're trying to achieve, or maybe trying to achieve in some of these later discussions. So you couldn't spread the virus, so you wouldn't get an exponential curve, because the virus would already find it very difficult to spread. The second thing to say is that there's very, very little evidence that anybody has significant levels of cross-immunity to previous coronaviruses. And in fact, I think he's messed the numbers up, because in most of the studies in Nature, for example, where they looked at all the T cells, so a slightly different part of the immune system to antibodies, and they looked at these T cells and they exposed them to various other types of coronaviruses. So there's about 6 coronaviruses, 3 of which are very serious, COVID being the obvious one, but also SARS and MERS, and then 3 or 4 of which sort of occur in animals and actually just sort of a common cold type of virus. And about something between 20% to 50%, depending on the studies, of people have some element of T cell reactivity in the lab, which nobody is really certain or likely to produce actual immunity. And there's several papers, and I'll put them in the links, to suggest that actually we're just sort of speculating here. But there's absolutely no evidence that that protects you, and there's absolutely no evidence that it's 80% of the population. So all of that unpacked is complete rubbish. The other thing that he then says is that when a new wave comes in, the 20% of the population are infected. So in the UK, that's about 14 million people, and we would have expected to see, with the rates of sort of 5 to 10% of people in ITU, around 1.4 million people needing intensive care. Obviously, we didn't see that. So the numbers don't quite add up already, but we'll carry on and bear with it. I wonder if we can watch it faster. Oh, sorry, yes. And he also talks about mucosal immunity, which is mostly around the lungs, and actually mucosal sort of T-cell action is mostly around bacteria and not viruses. I don't know why he keeps talking about mucosal.
Coronaviruses. It's got huge similarity, this SARS-CoV-2, to prior coronaviruses.
So SARS-CoV-2 is very similar to SARS. It's not very similar actually genetically, and there's another picture great from this Nature paper which I'll put up here, to old common cold types of viruses, and you can sort of see from the genome that actually it isn't very similar. So
our immune system has many mechanisms to react, but around 1 in 5 people, or 20%, will be less cross-immune, and they're
the other way around.
Has to go through. But in any case, as it goes through those people, you get the sad passing of the...
So again, that doesn't quite make sense. So he's saying this curve here is going through the 20% of people who aren't immune. So I'm just trying to follow his logic here. So if there's 20% of people who aren't immune, that means 80% of people are immune. So you wouldn't get this exponential curve, because essentially you're starting from a level of 80% immunity. So unless you know where these 20% of people live that aren't immune, and they all sort of live together, and then you just let the virus run through them completely separately, you're already reaching herd immunity levels, and you're keeping going. So you wouldn't get this exponential curve in this way. It doesn't quite add up. This is a de novo infection, not a immune compromised
susceptible, and
population.
You get the majority of the people who are susceptible to infection become infected, and then the virus has much more difficulty and stumbles over immune people all over the place.
So that is herd immunity that he's describing, and as I said, there's absolutely no evidence that any country has achieved it anywhere in the world.
So you get the turning of the curve, and this is entirely normal.
So he then attributes that to the turning of the curve, right? So where are we here? So this is where the lockdown came in March, just a bit here, early March for Italy, and then we are sort of March 23rd here. So we see a continued rise in deaths, which is sort of the natural course of coronavirus. Is about 18.5 days from first symptoms to death for the most case. A peak of deaths pretty much in line where the lockdowns were, about 2 weeks apart, and then coming down. And similarly, Sweden actually did have a variety of mandatory social distancing measures, recommendations actually, they weren't mandatory, and that's kind of the key point. But 50% of people work from home, which is very similar to what happened in the UK. There's a 50% drop in travel and a 50% drop in spending, and many schools were distance learning. The one thing that Sweden did do very early on that we didn't do was actually ban mass gatherings very early on in March. So between those two things, you see that, again, a slower rise and then a sort of long tail off as the cases come down again. And I don't actually know what happened in Ireland, but that's...
And then it comes down in the Gumpert's fashion.
The Gumpert's.
So, just to show for influenza, here's a publication in the last 10 years about the Spanish flu, and you see the classic Gumpert's curve as well.
So this is interesting, because this is only half the curve, and the other half of the curve is the second wave, but he didn't put that in, but anyway.
This is entirely kind of normal, if you will, for a new virus that comes along. Now, we're going to look at all-cause deaths, excess deaths in respiratory seasons over the...
Yeah, so I went on this website myself, and I'm just going to skip past this bit, because basically he's taken these two segments from all of the Euro-Momo countries. But actually, and again, I'll put a picture to this, you can just go on the website and it collects it for you cumulatively. And you can look at all the excess death across all the age groups for all the countries, and you can compare year on year, and you can quite clearly see that 2020 had an excess death rate that was twice any other year previous. I don't quite know why he gets quite so hang up, but if you sort of look on this graph, this is 2017, this is January, this is sort of the first quarter, the second quarter, and then the end again. And you've got winter here and summer, and winter here and summer, and winter here and summer, and then we had a very sort of average, and this is the average, I wouldn't say mild, but average winter, and then you have coronavirus, which sort of occurs in the spring and then levels out into the summer. And also he's got 65 plus years, he hasn't got the 85s. But yeah, we'll go through this quickly, because basically this graph doesn't make any sense at all.
Years, and this is from Euromomo. It's very important to
I
look
like the
at
way he says
excess
Euromomo.
death, because the measure of cases or infections depends on how much testing you're doing and how good the test is, and it's really noisy. So death is the best measurement. Euromomo has 360 million people in the countries
So
it tracks.
23 countries, I believe,
2018
across
excess
Europe.
death, and as you can see, it's here, and you can integrate or add up all of the weeks of death and get the totals. So we did that, and approximately 140,000 excess deaths.
Yeah, so I don't know how he did that, because if you look at the cumulative graphs for those particular years, it's nowhere near as high as that particular number. And again, this is the problem with putting stuff on YouTube and not scientific review. We could scrutinize those calculations and we could work out where the mistake was, if there was a mistake, but without being able to reproduce it, I don't understand where these numbers have come from, and he doesn't really explain either. So, happy to be corrected, but there doesn't really seem to be any basis for these numbers.
The over 45 years of age bracket.
And again, it doesn't really know why this is the age of interest. The excess death is useful.
It seems like a lot, but remember that's out of 360 million people, so it's actually a very small fraction. When we move on towards 2020, we note first that 2019 had a very soft flu season right up to early 2020. So
he's circulating this as the flu season, but as I said, this is almost all of it. This is summer. The flu season probably starts here, which is the beginning of winter. And yes, fairly mild flu season. Probably last year was a little bit mild as well. But this is, again, this isn't flu season. So I don't quite know what he's talking about.
A lot of people built up here who would otherwise sadly have passed.
Well, this is the summertime, so no.
So when COVID seasonally struck, there was a lot of...
So it didn't seasonally struck, it struck in March. I'd not necessarily know of any definition of winter that starts in March. But again, happy to be corrected if I don't know my seasons.
Being used. All those aged, susceptible, comorbid...
I don't really like the term dry tinder, but anyway.
Who are around to sadly be hit with the coronavirus. And the total, if you add it all up...
Essentially what he's saying is there's a slightly milder coronavirus season here, and then that's correlated with this big spike here, which doesn't quite add up. And there's another graph actually later in the video, and you can sort of see he actually publishes without really reading the graph, in that the correlation is actually very weak.
And this curve is around 180,000.
Again, I don't know where these numbers have come from.
It's not much different than 2018, and
it looks a lot different.
In 2018, although some hospitals...
But again, these are just, it's very difficult to compare the numbers, and that's the problem with peer review.
The difference is not great. Now, some people may comment that, oh yes, but we did lockdowns and masks and things this year.
So he's circulating this. This is 2019. So I don't know what he's talking about. We did lockdowns and masks like here at the beginning and towards the end of COVID, but as far as I'm aware, no one in Europe was locking down or wearing masks, particularly for influenza, although masks perhaps should be wearing.
So this is a fair compare. And actually the impact of
I don't know how he's come to
180,000
that
is lower
conclusion.
than the year 2000 for excess death in the season. So the main difference is that Corona, the season was very short and sharp.
That's
because
not
of
winter
the soft
season,
prior
so
season and other factors. It dramatically
I mean, this
occurred
whole
in
graph is
6
rubbish. We
weeks,
should just...
these excess deaths, rather
I
than
wonder if I can make it
around
go
4 or
faster,
5
actually.
months. So that's one big difference. So, explaining this, why were the
A little
deaths
bit
not
faster,
much
yeah.
different than 18? Well, one reason is that
Okay,
modelling...
so this is a great graph, and this is a great example of why you don't grab graphs from Twitter. So this graph is essentially well recognized, and Imperial sort of actually said this isn't one of our graphs and we're not related to it. And although he calls it the Imperial College graph, it's not a graph that any sort of has not been produced from any reputable source. And again, it's not linked to any actual paper, it's just got linked to some website. So it's very hard to work out, where the calculations came from, etc. But it's certainly not attributed to Neil Ferguson. And actually there's a paper here from the 30th of March from Neil Ferguson's group at the Imperial College, which did model Sweden and actually were predicting very accurately within a couple of tens, I believe, of deaths, or what was actually happening in Sweden at that time. So this is sort of bollocks, and I'm not sure entirely where it came from.
catastrophically high in its estimations. So here's one report that shows what was modelled by Imperial College and others
Which
for
is not true.
Sweden with no lockdown and with hard lockdown. And as you can see, the actual death impact is down here in the blue, and it's around 10 or 15 times lower than the modelling. And remember, Sweden had no lockdown, no masks, and even had hairdressers, bars open, a little bit of this.
So again, it's really important to actually understand what Sweden did. So very early on, they banned mass gatherings. They were also encouraged the over 70s to stay at home, and there was very clear public health messaging to socially distance, to not travel. They didn't make this mandatory, and one of the reasons they didn't is because the law prohibited them from doing that, but also the Swedes were fairly compliant. 50% of people worked from home. There was a 50% drop in travel in Stockholm. There was a 25% drop in spending in Stockholm, and they took the same GDP hit that lots of other countries did, and lost 8% of GDP. So the idea that the economy was flowing completely normally is rubbish. And also, as I said before, they banned mass gatherings very early on, which kind of leaves them quite ahead of the curve in some respects in terms of what the measures are. The fact that it wasn't mandated or not all businesses closed, I mean, that's fair enough, but they did take very significant measures. So the argument that they didn't do anything is again rubbish.
Distancing, but they allowed crowds up to 50 as well. So clearly the modelling was catastrophically high, and that's one explanation. Another study here pulled out by Coronapogue.
Sorry, that just made me laugh because he doesn't even know this guy's name. He just called him Coronapogue. But anyway, so this study actually is a real study, and I did find it. It's not from Imperial College. It's published by Uppsala University, and they got this wrong. And they kind of, they put it in preprint. It's not a peer-reviewed paper. They based the infection fatality ratios on data which is probably way too high. And as you can see, at the time they published the paper, they assumed a very high peak when actually it is right here. And I think it goes to show that if you can, reference the paper, which you could have done with a 5-minute Google, then you can go and read it and you can understand where the mistakes was. And that is science. You don't have to put a crazy paper up here attributed to Coronapogue and then take it apart, because that's not really scientific.
And you can see here for different amounts of lockdown, from no lockdown down to super hard lockdown, there's huge numbers predicted for Sweden, but the actual was less than 6,000. So again, the modelling out by a factor of 15 plus, and that's what threw the world into turmoil.
Yeah, again,
So,
we're going to, that isn't what threw the world into turmoil. I mean, that paper, particularly that paper, I don't think was ever even published. I could only find it in preprint. Again, correct me if I'm wrong. This graph, yeah, I don't know if I can look at this graph, to be honest. What is this?
Sweden from Johan Hellstrom done some great analysis, and as you can see, they had their epidemic, which waned, and now all during August, tiny amounts of ICU and mortality. And they had 16-year-olds up to 16 going to school all during the epidemic.
Distance learning from secondary
very
school, so
mild
slightly younger than
distancing
that.
and some other measures.
I wouldn't
They
say
just
mild
went through this
distancing. So,
classic
50% of people working from home and a 50% drop in travel is quite equivalent to lots of other European capital cities in full lockdown. So minimal social distancing is just not true.
Gompertz curve regardless. Opening up in the summer, nothing's happening. Pretty much community immunity established. to an effective level, and that's pretty.
So again, and this is really important, looking at antibody levels at least, there's very little evidence that Sweden's strategy has produced herd immunity like it would if the virus was running free, but as I keep saying repeatedly, Sweden did not let the virus run free, they did socially distance, and that's exactly why you see this curve come down like this.
Pretty much how it's always been with these epidemics. So that's Sweden. Just to show you another cut in Sweden, because it's topical, Johan I think pulled this out as well, and out of the nearly 6,000 mortality in total, only 870 were directly caused by COVID.
So this is a slightly silly graph. Maybe this is the medical fault for being confusing our terminology. So when we write a death certificate, you put the first cause at the top of the sort of primary, what happened, and then that's 1A, and then what contributed to that death is 1B, and what contributed to 1B is 1C. I'll give you an example. Do say, for example, that you died of a heart attack. We put myocardial infarction or heart attack as 1A, then we might put coronary artery disease as 1B as a sort of contributing factor. In the case of COVID, depending on your mechanism of death, you might write lots of things in 1A. You might write respiratory failure, you could write heart attack, you could write cardiac arrest, you could write kidney failure, for example, and then 1B you would write COVID, or some people might write directly COVID. At least that's how it is in the UK. I couldn't find much data about how death certificates are produced in Sweden, but I suspect it's very much the same thing. And we've seen the same sort of criticisms here, but actually it's just the way the deaths are recorded. But if it's contributory, then it's on the death certificate, then it is a COVID death.
With no other comorbidities, and obviously the average age was way up in the 70s too, and mostly.
And again, he doesn't find the average
correct
age, but if you do look at the care home data, it's just under 50% of deaths in Sweden were in care homes, so it's not mostly, it's actually less than the majority.
No comorbidity curve for mortality, and it's clearly massively smaller than the curve that you see given around to the world. Sweden, another perspective from Johan.
So this is a really interesting graph actually, and I went back, and so this is monthly deaths per million in Sweden. We'll talk about this. This is Spanish flu. This is actually a cholera outbreak, which is really interesting to think about. The first science to identify water and microbes as causing cholera and major outbreaks, and this is a very good example of public health science. So the irony is we don't talk about this, but this is a condition that was basically cured by good public health messaging. This is flu. This is the Spanish flu, and this spike is equivalent to around 34,500 deaths. And interestingly, it looked like at the time Sweden's response was very interesting, and it's actually worth kind of going into. So the approximate number of people who were infected in Sweden was about a third of the population at the time, which is about 5.8 million people, which gives an infection fatality rate, so the number of people infected, fatality rate of about 0.6%. Now, interestingly, we think the consensus data for coronavirus, which is this spike here, as Ivor is about to tell us, is also 0.6%. So, notice that the differences between these two graphs. Now, actually, if you go back and look at what Sweden's reaction was to Spanish flu, well, they didn't take much action at all, primarily because they were in the middle of a great war. They were neutral, but they didn't want to get involved, and they were trying to protect their economy and not do anything about it, and also it sort of snuck up on them in the way that it did in those times. So this is interesting because here absolutely no measures were taken, and they had a very high spike in deaths, and here with a virus with a similar level of infection fatality rate, a much lower number of deaths, and the difference is the number of people infected, and kind of reflects that actually Sweden did take a lot of precautions.
Interesting. He's pulled out all the data from the Swedish records, monthly death rates,
and again it's attributed to some dude on Twitter, which
population size
is very strange.
So let's look and see.
Although to be fair, maybe I'm just some dude on Twitter as well. Although I do
that's the Spanish flu spike.
A medical degree.
It is actually quite huge. It was a once in a century or maybe a few centuries event. But if we look down on the right, we're wondering, well, where is corona? Because we have the data now, and the spike is over for corona, or SARS-CoV-2. And actually, here's the corona spike. So that should put things in perspective.
And it does, and we talked about that, how effective social distancing is very, very useful, and the IFRs are very
10 or 20 years. So that's really what's actually happened in excess mortality. PLC pulled out some
Also,
great
sorry,
data.
that graph that he showed wasn't excess mortality. That was monthly deaths per million, which is not the same thing.
Everyone should know about this, and it speaks to why Sweden...
This is very interesting. So I looked at this guy, Humble Analysis, and actually his actual Twitter profile says nobody special, and that's all the information we have about him. So we have, or her, actually, sorry, apologies. So we have no idea who they are. But they do have this great theory about flu season, so we should definitely listen to that.
have been higher than other countries, particularly the Nordics. So we can look up mortality.org, but here's the graphs. So we see the Netherlands had a particularly soft prior season with a kind of...
So this is very interesting because he's very interested in this prior season, which is the summer. But he doesn't really care about what happened in 2014 at all. And yet this is clearly higher than this. And if you look at some other graphs as he goes through, you'll see the same pattern.
Expected deaths, 19 through to early 20. And Netherlands got hit quite hard then with SARS-CoV-2 or COVID, understandably, because a lot of people had built up who would have been very frail and otherwise probably would have passed
Again,
away
that's the summer that he's pointing
the same
at.
for Great Britain, a huge trough here and then a nasty spike when Corona came.
Yeah, so again, look, Great Britain, a huge trough here, but then the same, you know, almost the carbon copy here, and not. I mean, to be honest, these graphs are just silly, but it kind of illustrates the point that you can make the shapes look any way you want and interpret them. But actually, I could look at the same graphs and give you the same interpretation. And actually, by the own logic, like what's going on here. So also, if we had this was normal, then what's this spike about? This doesn't seem to be explained at all. So this theory that this is what dictates the death doesn't really stack up, and we'll see a bit more of that as he comes on to it.
Much. So this pattern is repeated throughout.
And again, this isn't repeated. Look, there's a big trough here, doesn't have a spike. Decent trough here, bigger spike. Doesn't make any sense.
Nearly all the countries. But let's look at Sweden. You see that Sweden certainly had a large trough. In fact, I think nearly 4,000 less than would usually occur. And interestingly, that's most of their spike.
And it's interesting because it's sort of like, what's it, 1650 for a couple of weeks. Yeah, I'm just going to move on. I think these are graphs are silly for the silly reason that we've talked about.
The Nordics that we have data for. I wonder, do they look different, right? Independent of lockdown. And sure enough, very different looking graph. They had normal enough death rates in the prior years. And again, they had a low spike for COVID. And Norway is similar to Finland.
I mean, this is very average. So, well, there should be, you know, there's a trough here, there should be a spike here. Why isn't there a spike here? This logic doesn't add up, and because it doesn't add up, because it's not made, it's made up.
Very different in Sweden. So this is most likely the biggest factor driving Sweden's numbers and most countries' numbers, actually, independent of lockdown and distancing. I have a gap here, and I don't have Denmark, so I'll just drop in Hungary. You can see they had actually quite a above average mortality the last couple of years and almost no impact from COVID, which goes in line with that.
Yeah, I just, whatever.
There's other analyses done, like David Spiegelhalter here, an analysis.
So David Spiegelhalter didn't make this graph, but he did post it on Twitter. And it's interesting, it's from a guy called Chris Hope, and it's a working paper, so it's not a published paper. But what he did is he looked at deaths per 100,000 of COVID, and he compared it to the flu intensity, which is a sort of scale of how intense flu were in the last 2 seasons. And he found this slightly negative correlation, and he gave us the R-squared number, which is 0.3, which is a pretty weak correlation. So this doesn't really explain very much of the variation at all, and there'll be a lot of difficulty with how flu was monitored, how COVID was monitored, and even at the biggest stretch of the imagination, you could also probably draw a line through here or through here. And as I said, this statistic that he's put up actually shows it's a fairly weak correlation, so certainly doesn't explain very much. I mean, it's interesting, but it doesn't explain very much.
Severity of prior flu season versus how hard COVID hit in deaths per 100,000. And as you can see, countries that had more severe prior seasons had very low COVID impact. And conversely, countries that had soft prior seasons tended to have high COVID impact, as you would expect. And finally, a publication just out, 16 possible factors.
This is great. This is actually my favourite bit. So these are all economists, number one. The second of all, this is a letter, as far as I can tell. I couldn't find the actual paper. Maybe there is a full paper, but you can just read it, really. So he says, the first thing it says is one factor is Sweden's lighter lockdown, why they had a much higher death rate than other countries in Norway, Denmark as well. And he said, but we suggest 15 other possible factors. Most significant are the dry tinder situation, which we just looked at, doesn't account for particularly much, but they said 25 to 50%, so if you believe the R rate, and there's no confounders, there's sort of 36% variation possibly contributing. That's interesting. Stockholm's larger population doesn't really qualify that. Sweden's higher immigrant population, that's possible, but it needs to be quantified in terms of comorbidities. And then it slightly gets off tangent into non-scientific things like probably more often at work, greater proportion of people in elderly care, it's fair enough. But Stockholm's sport break was a week later, but it was pretty early actually in the grand scheme of many European cities. Stockholm's system of elderly care, especially vulnerable people in nursing homes. Nursing homes was a big issue. This is my favourite one. They may have done less to try to cure elderly COVID patients. Well, there is no cure for COVID. It's supportive care only, so I don't know why they wrote that. Sweden may have been relatively understocked in protective equipment. I don't know about any evidence for that, and also they obviously don't because they said may. And sort of the rest of these 15 reasons are sort of mights and mays, and again, this is not very scientific or medical.
Sweden's high COVID death rate among the Nordics, and the lockdown differences are kind of number 16, and this team from the analysis say they're the least part of it. Their number one is the dry tinder situation in Sweden, as we just discussed, and they reckon it could account for up to 50% of their total death toll. I guess it's quite a bit higher than that. But they have another...
Well, it won't be higher than that because we just looked at how weak the correlation is.
14 reasons. Lockdown is in the halfpenny place, as we say in Ireland. Okay.
I don't know what that means.
Carl Hennigan, Professor of Evidence-Based Medicine at Oxford University, asked a great question quite a while ago. There's 50,000 pubs almost in the UK, and let's say 1,000 a week through the door. They've been open for a long time with no masks, right, and token distancing. That's nearly 300 million people.
I mean, so the pubs are supposed to have proper social distancing. I mean, I don't know if they are, but they are supposed to.
For actions in 6 weeks. Now, it's nearly 500 million now because it's 3 weeks later than this tweet. So how many outbreaks occurred with nearly half a...
But I love that he's found a professor of evidence-based medicine but still puts their tweets on.
Billion people in pubs with no masks moving around indoors. Well, let's take a look at the UK's actual mortality impact.
So this is interesting because he's decided to go with the mortality impact. But actually, if you look at the cases from early July through now, there is a slow rise and then a much higher rise. And that'll be driven by two things. The fact that you don't see a change in deaths is because we've seen that the cases rising, especially in the last couple of weeks, have been in the younger population, which are much, much less likely to die, so that would make sense. The second thing is, well, who is actually going to the pub? It's more likely to be younger people, fitter people, and if you're old and vulnerable and you've just come out of, several months of lockdown, just because the pubs are open does not mean that you will go. And certainly shops haven't seen that full bounce back, restaurants haven't seen that full bounce back, and many vulnerable people are still shielding, which vastly explains a lot of the behavioural differences we're seeing in terms of cases, and the deaths aren't reflected yet, but potentially will be if it spreads to the older population.
No masks, basic distancing. So let's see what happened. 2 months or more, actually 9.5 weeks since this began. Interesting. So not only is there no spike whatsoever, but quite the opposite, that during 10 weeks of this reality,
so I suppose he's proposing that the pubs open actually cured coronavirus.
Kept falling. And that's because these curves are baked in, essentially, as we've just...
So they aren't. And there's no evidence that they are either. So every country in the world took some sort of action against coronavirus. There aren't any countries in the world that actually did go for herd immunity, even though Sweden's being held up as one that's not true. And many other countries got back to normal life with much better curves by being very early and very aggressive. So you won't find any mention of, for example, New Zealand or Vietnam or South Korea in this presentation for exactly that reason, because it doesn't fit with the narrative. But these curves certainly aren't baked in, and it doesn't make sense either. So the virus travels from person to person. If you eliminate the person-to-person interactions, then you reduce the spread of the virus. That makes sense. It's spreading through the population at a set rate and a Gompertz curve like other epidemics. This isn't really science. This is sort of gobbledygook that's been mixed up together to look and sound like science, and that's kind of why I've sort of sat down and gone through it and wasted my evening.
Community immunity, the passing of the susceptible, the seasonal changes in the virome and other factors dictate this curve. And we humans...
He keeps saying virome, but I don't know what he means by that.
Trying to do fancy things that were never tried in history. often that just doesn't work.
So during the Spanish flu, they wore masks, there was social distancing, not in Sweden per se, but certainly in other countries. What does it say? It was cover your pores and your septic jaws was one of the, the cool taglines in the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic. So people did actually do those things, and that has been tried, and I think for good reason, because it was such a severe epidemic, and the same thing with COVID.
So there you are. So any pub owners in Ireland...
Oh, also all of Asia have been wearing masks since SARS as well.
This, or the Vintners Association, should be asking the question, why the hell have we had pubs closed in Ireland for the past few months? And it would be a very good question, and I think we've answered it here.
No.
Azu Greengrove have probably...
I love it. He just put up some Twitter person's full name, but then he puts the craziest graph that is very hard to look at.
But I'll just go through the basics. He painstakingly...
I think we're going to skip this, but essentially he's looking at the flu seasons in the USA, and he's sort of saying that because pneumonia hasn't increased during lockdown, that lockdowns don't work. And that's this area here where the sort of, you expect there to be a lockdown and to see a reduction in influenza. Unfortunately, the way that influenza and pneumonia deaths are recorded, which is quite common in the world, but in America as well, is that if you die of pneumonia, your death is recorded in a joint category with influenza and pneumonia, because it's very difficult sometimes to get accurate tests in time, especially if you're outside a hospital environment. So we don't always get a positive diagnosis of influenza, so if someone dies of pneumonia, it gets put in the same category. Very similarly with COVID, if COVID pneumonia was also sort of the deaths put together in many categories in America for the same reason, and there was actual concern in the CDC definition, which I'll put up here, that there would be some overlap, which probably explains the increased number of deaths despite lockdown.
We pulled out the USA seasonal impact of prior flus like 57 and 68, 69 and 59, and he also did a 1942 one, which was huge impact. But the notable thing here is they all have the double hump shape, which I'm going to describe to you shortly.
So it's interesting, because at the beginning he said that the normal shape is the Gompertz curve, but now the normal shape has become the double hump shape, which isn't a Gompertz curve at all. So where is that come from?
It is here, and it's no different really than these prior ones. Lesser impact actually, but we never did any lockdowns and things before. We did it for COVID. But another thing he pulled out is that, interestingly, these red lines show the influenza and respiratory disease patterns across the full year from week 1 to week 52 in the USA in prior years. But he pulled out the influenza for this year, 2020. Now this year had masses of lockdowns and masks all over the place, and that was a real unique difference with prior years. But notice in the tan space here, they got the exact same influenza and respiratory deaths as normal. So
yeah, so as I said, it's very difficult in terms of categories, especially because pneumonia is not influenza per se, it's a radiological diagnosis you make on the chest X-ray.
Here in 2020 was the corona impact being inappropriately put into influenza and pneumonia.
And then he picks up the same point, but doesn't put the two together.
See, 2020 influenza and pneumonia, no impact from lockdowns, didn't change the curve.
It comes down in the summer, just like it has
finally,
before.
I won't read this out, but I did this back.
So this is a funny graph, so I'm just going to go through some of the evidence that he puts up against lockdown. So the cost of lockdown, and this is some of this part is reasonable, it's not unreasonable. So cancer diagnosis being missed, that is a big problem, especially with lots of the routine, GP surgery appointments being closed, contact with GP professionals. But that's because services were overwhelmed with COVID and had to take COVID precautions to stop it spreading through and potentially overwhelming more parts of the service. But yes, that's really important, and we need to overwhelm that. Cardiac issues, I mean, obviously heart attacks and major issues were still treated all the way through the pandemic and still are, so I'm not quite sure what he means by that. Livelihoods destroyed, well, that's an economic argument, and yes, I'd imagine some have been destroyed, certainly, but there should be some economic step in to support that. Alternatively, good virus control means you can open up and get the economy going again. The two are synonymous, synergistic, they aren't against each other. Depression, yes, the mental health and suicides, I don't believe actually that is de facto in the UK, and I'll look that up and put a little bit of information about that there. Substance abuse, not sure what he meant, but yes, children, especially domestic abuse at home, it is a real issue, and that's something that we do have to worry about. Undermining of democracy, I'm not sure, but surely everybody doing something for society is a sort of, democratic process, I guess. I don't know. And freedoms, well, I mean, that comes with the territory, but again, you don't drive a tank down the motorway, you don't drive at 90 miles an hour around the high street, so we do accept some limitation of freedom for public health reasons. Many countries compared do not associate lower death rates with lockdown. There is actually some good evidence of meta-analysis, he doesn't mention them, that shows that lockdown early is associated with increased recovery rates, and it's also lockdown early and actually closing the borders particularly is associated with less cases overall. So between the two of them you'd expect there to be some change in death rates, but there wasn't a significant finding in that, but that's because there's lots of other measures inside that, and how you define lockdown, full lockdown and partial lockdown is very difficult, and also there's not much to compare to because most countries did some variant of that, and therefore the analysis becomes very difficult and a little bit biased. Do not show lockdown to lower impact correlation, so we talked about that, and these fatality rates, well, I don't know if he means case fatality or infection fatality, but he doesn't sort of specify, so that's a bit of a struggle. The rates are illustrated in many scenarios to fall not associated with lockdown. Yeah, I don't know what that means. And then distancing, yeah, so all of these measures are sort of cumulative, and certainly closing businesses may have been excessive if there's already very good social distancing and mask wearing and all the rest of it, but the problem is if you haven't got that, what else can you do? And it's an interesting situation like in the UK where we should have some social distancing, we should have mask wearing, but compliance is limited, and then what do you do if cases start rising again? Analysis in many countries shows lockdown added little. Michael Levitt again, he won a Nobel Prize for chemistry. Lockdown added little or nothing. It depends on the definition of that, I suppose, and it's worth having a look at these papers. And then there's some funny logic things here. So millions of grocery workers across Europe are the opposite of lockdown. Well, many of them were closed, and actually there's a report from a union, grocery workers union in the US with 1.3 million people, and found that actually they were less likely to die and get coronavirus overall than the general population, more likely because they're taking significant measures like masks, which are mandated in lots of big chains, and also lots of the places were actually closed, especially in Europe, and they were taking very careful precautions, especially in the UK. Supermarkets are very carefully precautioned. Essential workers across Europe, so healthcare workers particularly, and there's a study called the eLife study from Oxford showed that they were 2.5 times more likely to get coronavirus, unless you're working in ITU where you're 0.7 times, so much less, likely to catch coronavirus, and that reflects the fact that when we were working in ITU we were wearing full PPE the whole time, and much less likely to catch the virus. Many other Trump cheese dropped the lockdown and moved to distancing. Yeah, they did when the cases started to go down again. And then tubes for trains packed in London, so that's not quite the case, and actually it took a very long time to get back to full traffic on the tubes, and it actually coincides with cases rising. And then the high R is mostly asymptomatic, and I'm not sure that's really part of
May explaining all of the evidence against
science,
lockdown being effective.
and he skips
last
on
thing,
to
there's a link
this,
here
so
on
that's
the
just
bottom of this
his
video or in the first comment, and
papers.
it's just a Dropbox.
I think it's worth looking at them, as some of them are quite interesting, but it doesn't really bear out his thinking there.
Control trials of masks,
so this is interesting. So he talks about, this is a meta-analysis of randomized control trials where you've taken one group and you've compared another group and you've looked at masks and the spread of viruses. However, there are lots and lots of systematic reviews looking at all the observational trials, and at least 2 or even 3 have shown that masks actually are an incredibly effective intervention in the spread of influenza or in other respiratory viruses. And interestingly, and I'll put a link to the paper, in coronavirus particularly, very, very actually effective. So this is sort of slightly out of date, and probably the reason being is that the randomized control trials are probably not the right way, or not big enough studies to actually be able to measure behavior in this way. and observational trial data is better, and certainly lots of meta-analysis reflect that. But ultimately, if there is no evidence, but it might be a good idea, why not wear a mask? Because there is zero evidence of harm, and that's the big thing.
No way were they worth using. They might even backfire. And it all changed in June 2020, and suddenly people somewhere, influential people, wanted everyone in masks. So, but I go with 40 years of science rather than a few weeks of...
So he doesn't go with science ever, but okay.
...questionable science in quotes. So that's just the reality with masks. Just to illustrate it empirically, here's Germany, mandatory masks came in, curve never changed, kept falling.
So this is a random graph from Germany. Yes, masks came here late, but obviously you can see that they've taken significant measures, and this was more to prevent a second wave. But it doesn't mention sort of countries which you had mandated masks very early on, and a very chief example of that, March sort of 15th or 16th, Vietnam had a mandated masks and actually has had one of the best pandemic responses in the world despite very low levels of resources, and equally lots of Asian countries that did very well, South Korea, Singapore, very widespread use of masks as well. So again, you can pick your data to make any point you want, really. It just goes through some random countries, but I've given you those four which are the same. And again, these are all orders which came in after the lockdown. After the pandemic.
Between mandatory mask orders whenever they come in and any impact on outcomes. Okay, so that's just the way it is. So sorry about that, but the mandatory and prison sentences and arguments with police and fines all around masks are very, very non-evidence-based, bad science.
So that's not true. They are evidence-based to some extent, as best they can be. And this is bad science when you're sort of just pointing at pictures and making accusations, and you aren't letting anybody peer review your work, and you're putting it on YouTube, which is also not science.
And the empirical data reflects that. So, sorry guys. Now, I'm going to just remind you now about 140k excess deaths in 18.
Again, I mean, he's gone back to this
400 million people
graph, but I don't know.
Season and 180 for this year. And we've just gone through by lockdown and other measures. Didn't really change anything. So this comparison is what it is. And it may surprise many people that this is it. Maybe
he's gone back to it, but it means as little as it meant the first time.
Other years in the last 20 were higher again. And no panic occurred and no damage to our society. So there you are. Seasonality, very important, so I'm going to go through it with updated figures.
It's interesting. I don't know why seasonality he considers to be important. The first thing is we had the first sort of significant wave of coronavirus in the spring, which isn't a seasonal, time at all in any way. And then we came out of lockdown when people could go outside and easily socially distance and were socially distancing, wearing masks and all the rest of it. So it's not quite the evidence of a summertime, and he sort of then starts to confuse immunity with seasonality. It all gets a bit complicated.
Coronaviruses are sharply seasonal, super seasonal, like influenza. This has been known for a long, long time. It's being denied in the past few months for some reason, but it's been known. So I'm going to show you here Italy, deaths per million. March, April, it rolls up and down, independent of the lockdowns they tried. It happened. But look at Brazil and Peru, a longer, steadier rise. And interestingly, Brazil had no lockdown.
So it's interesting because you can actually go on this website and you can pick any random 5 countries and you can say very much about them. If you put Poland in here, for example, which isn't a temperate country, it looks almost exactly the same in terms of this compared to Italy. So again, this is just sort of random line generation. There's lots and lots of reasons to look at, the responses that different countries have had. But probably not in this way, which is a bit scattergun and very biased.
And Peru had a hard lockdown, military style, with mandatory masks and everything back here in March, okay, and hard lockdown. But look, right, Peru, if anything, is worse. So this is just re-stressing the point about lockdown. However, there's something else interesting. I've left space here to the left. What about November 2019? Why am I interested in showing that? Well, because it's crucial. Because in 2019, November, SARS-CoV-2 has been verified in human sewage samples, just like it has been for Spain and elsewhere in Europe. So this virus, SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID in some people, was circulating in the population in Brazil, back here, same as Europe. But look at the difference of the virome triggering, right? Totally different behavior. So the virome is...
I mean, I don't know what he's talking about in terms of virome triggering, but it is interesting that, we forget that about good proportion of people's feces contains SARS-CoV-2, and that has been postulated to be a way of spreading. I don't think it's really relevant to anything on this graph, but
complex, and
it's interesting.
It rises based on UV and humidity and human immune, seasonal variations, many things, and it just ignores the human medieval science interventions that we've done this year.
Again, I mean, this is a very high peak, and then a lockdown, and then Italy's curve came down. I'd have to go back away and look at what happened in Peru and Brazil, but equally, there's a very strong conclusions from some pretty lines, to be honest.
Edgar Hope Simpson, a doctor who spent 50 years plus on studying all of what we're talking about and a lot more, and he certainly got into the whole seasonal aspect because it's huge. So let's use his knowledge and have a look at these countries. So we look back at Italy here, dramatically different than Brazil with no lockdown, Peru with a lockdown. But the big difference is these southern tropical regions, completely different triggering than the northern temperate.
So it's interesting he doesn't, take any other temperate zones like in Asia, for example, or like China, Singapore, South Korea, hot countries, lots of COVID. New Zealand at the time was going through their sort of summer into winter and actually did very well, and we were going out of our winter into summer and did very badly. So I think they've done a bit of a disservice really, and they're slightly pulling random lines from random books, and I don't quite understand actually what the point they're trying to make, because at the beginning he sort of makes this point about there being widespread immunity and T-cell immunity for whatever that means, and now we're talking about flu seasons.
Which is exactly what you do.
Is it meant to be reassuring? I don't really understand it, to be
worry
honest.
about where on the axis they occur in terms of exact month. It's more around the seasonal relative differences and regional differences independent of lockdowns. Europe versus USA.
So again, I mean, Peru and Brazil have quite similar sort of temperate zones and fairly similar climates at that time of year. So if it is independent, then why are they slightly different lines? I mean, again, that doesn't really make sense. The logic kind of falls apart. What's this?
A lot of people asking about USA, and it is tough over there because while Europe is long finished with the epidemic, USA got a second kind of surge, and a lot of people are misunderstanding this. They think
so again, he's going through deaths, but if you look at cases, especially in Europe, there's a big spike here, which he has not put up. I can't imagine why.
I think it's a second wave. It's not a second wave. So USA, if it was only northeast USA you were looking at, which is seasonally, regionally like Europe, you see this in the data. It behaves just like Europe, and it's fallen off to nothing. However, this part of the curve is southern USA, and that's what's driving the extended hump. And this is the classic double hump we've seen for all prior influenza epidemics.
But it's not a Gompertz curve.
This is actually normal. Even though all deaths are sad, it is fading, coming down now, which is good news. So a little more detail. I pulled the data from the US database, and I'm going to use the same scale here of deaths per million, up to 70. And here's Northeast. New York got hit really hard, of course, but the Northeast US, you've got the Gompertz type curve like Northern Europe, and that's because it's Northern tempered type pattern, Europe-like. When we look at the South, it's very different. Not only is it surging out here, right, in a different time frame, but overall the impact in deaths per million daily is massively lower than the Northeast, because these are the same.
So this is interesting. So New York had a big spike, got it under control, haven't had any problems. Lots of other countries didn't have a big spike, but weren't very compliant with lots of the measures and demanded things to be reopened, and then had another larger outbreak, and then had to return to those measures, and that's come down. It's very difficult to argue that this is due to significant changes in temperature. I mean, there are some significant changes in temperature, but ultimately it's the same hemisphere, the same season. And actually, this is the summertime, so again, it slightly goes against what he's about to say about summertime immunity, which doesn't all quite add up.
Like Mexico and desert regions.
Mexico-like.
Midwest is actually more like northern tempered type pattern Europe-like, or like Northeast America, and particularly showed in Europe that the epidemic.
Oh yeah. Let's go back because this is important.
Now the case-demic I'm going to kind of roll to a close with. There's hysteria the last few months over the summer, even though it clearly showed in Europe that the epidemic was over since May. And the reason is because we're hyper-testing with PCR. So well, first of all,
I don't know if you can say that the epidemic is over looking at these case numbers. The second thing anyway, for the UK at least, between August and September the 1st, we did approximately exactly the same number of tests. Nothing particularly changed about the PCR methodology or anything that we collected the test or where the labs were processed. And we did a sort of 175,000 odd tests in August and maybe 190,000 September 1st. And between those two time points, the number of cases in the UK increased by 300%. So it's very hard to see how that can be a case-demic or because of extra testing, and it almost seems like very much like wishful thinking that doesn't really bear out in reality. The fact that we're not seeing initial deaths and hospitalizations is because, and we can see that again in the data, that the cases are predominantly in the younger population. Now, normally you might say, oh, great, you can get immunity in the younger population. But actually, they then spread to the older population, and that's when you start seeing hospitalizations, which we're now seeing in France, and then eventual possible deaths. So again, this is a bit premature to say the pandemic is over, and that's the explanation. And this whole thing about hyper-testing, with PCR, it doesn't really bear out in the data of the actual number of tests that we are doing. And we've seen that phenomenon everywhere in Europe.
For Europe, and you see the epidemics come down. This was an epidemic, in fairness, and this is not an epidemic.
Is this deaths or cases? What is this?
June, July. However, if you kept testing with PCR and in fact increased your testing, you would find viral fragments, dead virus, people who recovered months ago who were asymptomatic. You'll find some positive cases, but there'll be very little impact. You'll have a case-demic.
Yeah, so this is actually a really good graph, because look, this is the UK. So around about here in April, we were doing about 11,000 tests a day. And by the time we got to August 1st, which is here, and this is actually the opposite of his point, we were doing much more tests a day, probably about 170,000, so nearly 20 times as much. And yet the numbers go down. And if you look at the case positivity, how many cases were actually positive for how many tests you were doing, it also went down, as the number of true cases actually went down in the population due to the measures that we took and social distancing. And actually now we have up till September an increase in those numbers, again reflecting a true rise in the cases. So all of this is just rubbish.
And that's the problem we're seeing in Europe over the past couple of months with stringent measures, draconian measures based on PCR testing. So this is a great post for you to get an idea of the problems with PCR testing. Just Google this.
I mean, there are issues with PCR testing, and this paper is quite interesting. So what they did is they took the swab that you stick in your nose and they stuck it in a egg, which is essentially how you culture viruses, and you try and grow the virus from the swab and the PCR result that was positive. So the idea being that if you can't actually grow virus, then you aren't infectious. Now this is very interesting, but it doesn't really impact on the actual numbers, because as I said already, we've seen a big number despite the number of tests not really changing, and an increase in the number of actual cases. But also, we haven't changed the way that we're doing the tests. So although this is interesting, it would only be really impactful if we suddenly changed to a new type of test which is more inaccurate. And as far as we can tell so far, the tests remain to be sort of 99% specific and 99% sensitive, which mean the false positive rate and the false negative rate are very, very, very low.
Term here, there's the link. Professor Carl Hennigan again goes through the challenges. If you
which has been quite controversial.
Tests, they find viral dead fragments. They don't find full live virus. They can't identify that. They're calling them cases when they get a PCR positive. They are not, mostly. A case is hospitalization with severe impacts, or COVID-19.
I mean, that's not a case definition by anyone's anyone's definition. You don't have to be hospitalized to be a case. So I don't know where he's got that from.
The disease. These are simply positive tests from a viral fragment test kit. They are not cases. So a lot of confusion. This is what causes the case-demic. So to show a few countries, Ireland, we had an epidemic, rising cases and fall, and we had deaths follow it, sadly. Older, comorbid, average age 82, median age 84. So yes, we had an impact. Epidemic ends, but now we test. We're getting PCR false positives, historical infections.
So again, I mean, I don't know what the rates of testing were in Ireland actually between August 1st and September 5th, but I'm going to look them up, and I'm going to play on a hunch that they didn't change significantly, just like in the UK they didn't change significantly, and we saw cases rising, and we didn't see changes in deaths and hospitalizations because they were rising predominantly in the younger population.
So for Ireland in August, We had 700 cancer deaths, we had 33 suicides, we had effectively 0 COVID deaths on the record. So what all people are talking about is COVID. They don't care about the suicides, the cancers, the economic catastrophe.
So none of that is true, and actually the way to make sure that you can treat cancer and you can free up the service to do the routine and the urgent cancer work, to make sure that it is safe to open up businesses with social distancing, to get people back to schools, and to take care of the economy, is to control the virus. And you see that, time and time again internationally. Those countries that had the biggest GDP hit in terms of the virus over the pandemic are also the countries with the worst virus control. And the countries that did very well, in contrast, had a much lower economic hit as a consequence. And again, we keep talking about, we don't need to lock down. Sweden didn't, their economy's fine. Sweden took a 8% GDP hit, and 50% people work from home, and people didn't go into Stockholm, 40% reduction in travel. So this myth that, we've only cared about COVID is just not true. And in fact, in the UK, the lockdown was, international, national, but hospitals certainly weren't locked down. And the reason that we actually couldn't do a lot of the other work was because we were overwhelmed with COVID cases, and then we couldn't safely bring non-COVID patients in without spreading the virus further. And the way to not do that the second time is to make sure that we don't spread the virus, and we take all measures to control the virus, and then keep the hospitals going as much as we can.
People don't seem to care about anything, even though they don't realise the epidemic's gone.
So that's a nice myth, but
UK
it's not true.
show it's the same problem. Enormous cases, local lockdowns.
Oh yes, this is great. So look, so he's actually put up the UK. So look, August 1st, September 5th, you see a threefold roughly rise in cases. There isn't increased testing. There's no evidence of false positives. Not sure about historical infections. Some true positives. I mean, yes, that would make sense. They're all true positives. But we haven't seen a significant rise up until right now, when we're starting to see a slight uptick in hospitalizations. So as the pandemic, as the infection moves into the older group.
Really happening. Now, as we come into fall and winter, we will see a natural rise in the viral. We'll see influenza, we'll see
Viral.
impacts in hospitals, we'll see SARS-CoV-2 rising again, but that will be more normal winter resurgent of influenza like prior years, I would say. Germany...
Whoa. So if COVID-2 now comes back, remember right at the beginning of the video he told us that 80% of people are already immune to coronavirus and 20% of people are susceptible, and it's all very sad and the pandemic's over. So why are we seeing a resurgence now in winter? So influenza, we see annual seasons because the influenza strain changes significantly and you don't have immunity from one season to the next, which is why we have to vaccinate every year. Coronavirus, obviously, well, there's no evidence so far that there's a significant change in the strain of the virus. So unless he's suggesting that his immunity theory is wrong, or this double hump, or it's not a Gompertz curve. See, the issue here is that he's tried to explain multiple times what will happen, and then has now come up against some different data, and the model that he proposed right at the beginning of the video, even in 27 minutes, is now changing at the end. And again, there's no logic or to it, and it's all sort of very pretty graphs without much sort of coherent sort of medicine behind it.
Same story, I won't read it out. Switzerland, exact same story. They brought in mandatory masks in these countries back here when the epidemic was already over. That doesn't affect anything. Spain is being called out as having a second wave in the making, and sure.
So mask wearing actually, when cases are low, to get people used to it and into the habit, is probably quite a good idea, because if you struggle with compliance when cases start to really rise and people aren't used to the idea, then it's much more difficult to implement. So actually, it may not have much difference when cases are low, and that's the fair point. But when cases start to rise again, it's a good way to control the spread and to give yourself more time to react.
The deaths are rising a little, but as we'll see, that's not unusual in Spain as they head into fall and winter.
So these are COVID deaths that he's pointing at, not excess deaths and not deaths from other causes. So again, it's slightly odd that he's now saying that actually some of these cases must be true because people are actually dying from them, and then he goes on to sort of qualify, it's only 1 million people a day, but as I said, cases rise in the younger group, they spread to the older group, and then we start to see deaths and impact, and that's exactly what we saw in Spain and France and starting to see here in the UK.
Here and there, but there's only around 1 death per million people per day in Spain. at the moment, and that's being seen as a surge. So it's vastly lower than when the real epidemic occurred. But this will probably grow. But
so again, this is important because actually these two spikes aren't comparable. So testing capacity here, or at least in the UK, and I suspect the rest of Europe, was about 10 times, 20 times less than it was here. So at the time that the initial rise was coming, most countries were missing probably about 90% of the actual cases in the community through a lack of testing. At least certainly we were in the UK. So you can take these case numbers with a pinch of salt because we're probably seeing 10 times those numbers in the community. So this sort of hump is not really directly comparable when you've got much more testing and you can actually get most, or at least a good majority of the actual cases. And that kind of reflects the fact that we're seeing, the death rates probably 10 times less than they were before, because actually this is more reflective of the true infection fatality ratio, or case fatality ratio at least, in this graph. And I think that's really important because that kind of explains why the numbers look so drastically different. I don't really again understand what his point is.
the second wave by any means, but you can see the enormous amount of cases here.
I mean, it looks like a
Absurd,
second wave, but
and then these very small impacts. And then we've got Netherlands, same story, and we've got France, same story. Talk of a second wave in France now, just because hospitalizations have gone up a bit coming into the fall, but again, similar summary. And US, I'll acknowledge, as I already have, that because of the southern and western regions, they're viral triggered, so they genuinely do have, with extra cases, a rise in mortality, but thankfully that's falling down now too.
I mean, I don't know what he means virome triggered, but there's a rise in cases in another part of the US perhaps. Their testing is pretty good, so they're probably capturing lots of cases, to be fair, and their death rates haven't really changed from the start of the pandemic, and they're still having significant impact as it spreads to a new population.
So have we seen this before, like the case-demic phenomenon? And this is important. This is from a government document, and it shows the H1N1 swine flu, where there were actual impacts in 2009 in the winter, and people died. Not nearly.
It's actually very hard to read this graph. I don't know what all the bars mean. He doesn't really explain it.
Test called flu chip, and they started testing like crazy. And all during that summer when the deaths were gone from swine flu.
So the way to control an epidemic is to test a lot, so you know where it is, so you can isolate people. So not to test like crazy, it's the way that you stop it spreading to vulnerable people by isolating as much as you can in the community. It's not a freak out, it's just responsible testing and how you control the virus, and then look what happens.
Huge tests and all the media going crazy, but no one was dying. So that was a case-demic, and they kept pushing it even into the fall, right? But
and then the pandemic disappears.
But there was a case-demic going on and a lot of hysteria until eventually they gave up on it. Now, the interesting thing is there were no lockdowns or masks back here during this safe summer, and that may have helped the following winter season be very soft because you had a lot of community immunity develop over.
So he's just said that. What has he said? He said that there's a soft summer when nobody died. But at the beginning of the video, he said soft summers cause lots of deaths in the winter. And then he said in soft summers, you get community immunity developing. But he's also just said at the same time that this soft summer, there aren't any cases. These aren't real cases. So how are people developing community immunity when they aren't real cases in the first place? So already there's a conflict of logic there, it almost in three ways from the beginning of the video. So this doesn't make any sense.
Death impact. So that point we're going to bring up at the end again in the context.
Oh, I hope so, yeah. It's a really useful point.
Last one on this, it just shows the UK, and here's the seasonal increases in mortality, perfectly normal with influenzas, and down here we have the testing. But in 2010, in the summer, they were testing like crazy because of the swine flu panic. So you see an enormous spike in cases, but actually the lowest death that summer of the past 20 years. So it shows you the danger of a case-demic.
What's the danger of testing? We tested a lot and no people died. Sorry, I don't. Maybe it's too late. I'm just not following these points anymore. Apologies if that made sense.
Understand why case-demics happen and the driving forces behind them. So
I mean, that's a horrible picture, isn't it?
Newspaper back in 2010 did this article. It's comprehensive and it really is a great article and explains a lot of what goes on when these things occur. So I recommend.
Looks like it's about vaccinations.
Now, another thing in terms of second waves in Europe and Spain and anywhere, it's important to note that, influenza are shown in the 3 curves here, and they do fall in the summer, and then as you get into the fall, when this is only August, you see that you start seeing more influenza.
So who's going to tell Ivor Cummins that these are different influenza strains every year? I guess no one.
This is normal, and the blue bars are coronavirus cases in 2020, and they're following a similar pattern.
So what we're saying then is that we all had immunity here, and that's why this came down. And we all lost our immunity by the winter time again? But I thought the epidemic was over. So how is the epidemic not over? Is this another epidemic? Well, what's he saying? Does anyone know what he's saying? I don't know.
There's nothing too abnormal about this, and that's probably important to internalise. Okay, so that's just a point to...
I mean, there's a lot abnormal about this. I've watched this for half an hour now.
Everyone's fear-mongering about second waves, and nothing is impossible to sense.
I think that's a good point. So there's this thing about fear-mongering and scaremongering, and I think if somebody tells you something that's scary for personal benefit, to sort of, I don't know, drive prices down or something, then you could say, yeah, that's fear-mongering, or for just for their own benefit or fun, then that's fear-mongering. But, you know, if scientists and doctors and medical people say, I'm very, very worried about a second wave, and we should take better precautions to prevent it, it's hard to really, you know, say that is fear-mongering, because what exactly is that person trying to achieve? And specifically, you know, there's lots of people saying, oh, you know, we shouldn't listen to this person, they're just fear-mongering. Well, actually, you're just not listening to things that you don't want to listen to, and that's your fear. That's not, you know, that's not the person trying to induce that fear. And it's, I think, videos and people like this, for example, who are playing the other side of the coin and trying to be falsely reassuring with essentially quite a lot of nonsense, is far more dangerous, actually. And this is probably, actually, you know, the kind of things that drives behaviour, and behaviour being the only defence that we have against coronavirus. And in that case, I think that's actually pretty criminal.
So here we show Spain again, and we show the huge, up to 900 deaths per day at the peak of the actual epidemic. And then, as I described, community immunity passing up the susceptible seasonal vectors, it fell right down to nothing. So in May, it was effectively gone. I think these deaths were added in from a prior period. So recently, there's been talk of hospitalizations and indeed there's mortality. Now, this is with COVID as opposed to necessarily from COVID. So I've got to be careful here. But there is a rise, and people are talking about second waves. But what I would suggest is a second wave, a true one, would look something like this. It would rise up and come back down again and be very impactful. But this kind of coming into fall increase is nothing like that so far. And I want to remind people of Euromomo, which is the mortality excess.
I do like the way he says Euromomo, though.
You can see in 17, there's the big hump in excess mortality, and in 18, 19 was softer, right? And there's COVID, 2020. But let's look at 17 and bring it down.
Oh, but this is interesting, right? So, you know, this is I guess this is Spain. I don't know, but where's the trough that explains COVID here? You know, like that was the pattern, right? That was the pattern at the beginning. This is the consistency of logic is very strange, and he's about to put this over here, and I don't really know why he's going to do that, because this is going up, and this could be the foothills of, you know, a deaths, and it probably actually end up all being, but you know, it doesn't tell you anything at all, to be honest.
Going into 21 was even like 17. So let's bring it down here and extend out the months out to March and scale it approximately. Well, Spain could easily be heading into this in terms of mortality. Right? But this will be actually normal, and in here you're going to have...
But this is all excess mortality, and this is COVID death mortality. So these are different measures, right? And lots of conditions get worse in the winter, not just influenza, there's other respiratory viruses, there's also heart attacks get worse, there's lots of stress in the summer, lots of increased mental health problems. So there's lots and lots of reasons to have excess seasonal variations in mortality, and that's actually completely normal for almost all human populations. So yes, Spain might be doing this, but this is COVID death, this isn't excess mortality. So these two lines, and they're different colours for a reason, because they're not measuring the same things. Again, I don't know what exactly he's trying to assess, other than we should see some rises in Spain as death, and that's okay.
Then it may kick out the
I don't know what he's talking about.
And they'll attribute more to COVID-2 and COVID. But either way, this is coming anyway. So, you know, we've got to be careful that this is not attributed to some kind of second wave, if it does look just like pretty much like 17. But we'll see.
Again, I don't know why he's picked out 17, but yeah, anyway. It's just... Again, as I said, this doesn't make any sense.
Now, there is one difference this year, however. Even though lockdowns and stuff don't really work, they could have an effect that's negative. They're going to cause way more cancer deaths from late diagnoses, way more, malnourishment and suicide and dreadful suffering.
So I'm not sure about the suicide, but I'm fairly sure the figures don't really show that happened in lockdown. Malnourishment, I mean, that's a pretty scaling issue, and we had a big child poverty scandal over the summertime, and eventually the government U-turned and did actually start continue to support especially child malnourishment, and the late cancer diagnosis is a real big problem. But as I said, the way to get the health service back to normal is to prevent the preventable diseases, and COVID is a preventable disease. Wash your hands, cover your face, socially distance, avoid unnecessary travel, and you won't get it, and you won't spread it. More importantly, so it is avoidable, and it's the public behaviour measures that make it avoidable, which is why this advice is particularly calling.
Impacts due to destroying economies, and they're taking away our cherished freedoms and causing terrible societal impacts. So the lockdowns and all that are causing huge damage, and that's being acknowledged in mainstream media. But here's another potential damage. For the first time in history, based on poor science, we've been putting in draconian measures all summer.
I mean, if you were to look for a video that demonstrated poor science, I would look at this.
It's the safe period where the virus can circulate with very low mortality, and you can build T-cell and build mucosal and build population community immunity, and that's going to tend to protect the old and the frail next winter. But we've kind of gone in and tried to stop it for the first time in history.
So now he's saying that in summertime, you build the immunity that he said at the beginning of the video that we all had already, or that 20% of us didn't have and they all passed away, and now we all have, and then we have to get ready for winter by getting it. And then he's saying that it's good to see cases rising with low mortality, but then he just said 5 minutes ago that that's because of the case-demic. The internal logic here is really lacking, and it's because it's not based on anything other than pretty pictures and funny graphs and people on Twitter.
Reasonable to hypothesize is the winter could be relatively worse than it needs to be in terms of death and injury of the susceptible and the weak, the very ones we want to protect. So wouldn't it be ironic if actually what would have been a mid-range winter actually became worse because we had not developed the normal ancestral evolutionary summer period community immunity? Now that would be...
So he's saying that in the summer we develop immunity from the sun? What's he... What?
An enormous backfire. And it probably shows the potential dangers of doing things...
That guy's as pissed off as I am.
Like Sweden did. Doing things that are not based on good science and continuing them all summer.
I hate that when he says science. It makes me feel sick.
Consequences, in which case the people pushing this would tend to have blood on their hands next winter.
So I think this is a really important point, and I felt this is part of the reason that I sort of came and looked at this video. So I worked in the COVID ICU. I saw these poor patients who had very little choice, very little information, and were very, very sick, and many of them passed away. And the only thing that protected them wasn't really what ITU did for them. We couldn't do very much for many of them. It was mostly just supportive care and do the best we could for as long as we could. And these are people that were public facing, in the public eye, very little choice of behaviour, or and the only thing that protected them was the public. So we saw these huge number of cases come in, we saw the lockdown come in, and we saw the cases disappear, and actually gave us time to look after the sick patients that we have and let a good majority of them recover. So the idea that, we can throw around phrases, especially for this guy, and I'm sorry I'm going to be rude now, but who's just a guy who did a biochemical engineering degree 30 years ago, never been in a hospital, isn't a medic, doesn't understand science, doesn't publish any paper that I can see in any journal at any time, to say that people advocating for better public health measures to protect hospitals and the economy and other patients, my patients, have blood on their hands is sickening, and actually it's made me really angry, despite the fact that being 1 a.m. and having to watch that 3 times. And I would really heartily people, especially doctors and medics, watch this, go away, Google, look at the papers for yourself, watch this video again, and really you need to stop promoting this stuff because it's so dangerous. and I can't really stress enough, what we've been through as a country, what we've been through as a world already, and people like this who are just about to plug their Patreon to make a little bit of cash with some nice pretty graphs pulled off Twitter, which entirely really are almost entirely bollocks. Sorry to say, I have to bleep that out, I guess. It's just sickening, and I think lots of medics would probably agree. And if you are a medic and you have been showing this video, please do have a look at the paper. And if you're not a medic and you're a member of the general public, then this video is for you, in that this is not science, this is not facts. These are a bunch of pretty graphs and lines, which actually, by the end of this, I found it actually pretty upsetting, if I'm honest with you.
Unintended consequences occur all the time, but they most frequently occur when you don't follow the science, the best science.
Oh my god.
That's
I don't think as the guy is publishing his stuff on YouTube is following any science, and this is a sort of definition of the charlatans, the quackery in the 2020 age, and it's quite frankly disgusting.
This is actually what I'd have a concern with, that we squandered a summer where we could have had the normal evolutionary, relatively safe spread of this virus when people had high immune function, and just after the susceptible had already passed. A safe spread, if you will.
I mean, just to be very clear, the man is not an epidemiologist, a virologist, a doctor, a scientist in the traditional sense, at least. He doesn't publish any of his research, and he's got a slick YouTube and a nice voice. I give him that. I like the way he says Euromomo, but this is not somebody that anybody should be listening to, and this is incredibly dangerous stuff.
And that may put the vulnerable at greater risk next winter.
He doesn't care about them, frankly.
Tragic. And you can add that to all the extra effects of lockdown, etc., and all the other problems which have been acknowledged all over the world now, in the media even. So I'll leave it at that, but I think it's a sobering thought, and I'm going to be watching like a hawk in the coming months.
Oh, good.
For exactly what the winter rises and patterns are, and using our worldwide network of solid scientists.
I'm just going to stop it there. His worldwide network of people on Twitter, like, what was that guy's name? The humble analysis dude who's nobody special. Yeah, the worldwide network. So I think, this has been a long video, and this stuff is really, really dangerous, and I put a whole bunch of links, and feel free to discuss this, and I'm open to discuss anything, but this is not how science is done, and it's a failure of communication. It's a failure. This actual communication is much better than lots of stuff that real scientists and doctors have been doing, and it's something that we need to work on, because it's the only thing that we have to fight coronavirus in the future. But I hope maybe that you'll share this video and show other people, and then just tell them to do the basics. Wash your hands, cover your face, make space, and just be kind and look after each other, because ultimately that's still the only thing that we have to treat coronavirus and protect ourselves. Alright, I'm going to probably have to go to bed now.